Hi, I'm Bonnie Steinroeder, and I'm the pastor.
And my name is John Moore, and I'm the policeman.
We want to welcome you tonight to our final episode of Season 1 of The Pastor and the Policeman. We're going to be talking tonight about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Johns will tell us a little bit about them. But the book that we've used tonight is called Unfinished Business, Racial Equality in American History by Michael Claremont.
Okay, good intro, Bonnie. As you said, it's about 3 amendments tonight, so we're taking on a large order. The 13th Amendment, without going into the specific language, is about the abolition of slavery. 14th Amendment is about the equal protection under the laws. And the 15th Amendment is about voting rights. And in this book, Professor Claremont goes to great lengths to chronologically lay out our history in this country in terms of racial equality. He specifically zeroes in on our 3 branches of government. And he doesn't pull any punches, and I think to a certain extent he's somewhat disappointed about how our government has handled racial equality over a 200-plus year history.
I was going to say as well, he should be.
I mean, if you read this book and knowing where he comes from, being a lawyer, being a professor of law, he's going to spend a lot of time on the judiciary, the court system, which he does.
Right.
And I saw a certain pattern in here in terms of the information that he lays out to the reader, whereby a lot of our racial history ends up in the court system, followed by the legislature that passes laws, and then lastly the executive branch, which executes them. So it's kind of a sordid history over 200 years. I found it very informative. Some of the stuff I had read about before or studied before, but I think he put it together quite well.
I agree with that. And we're really fortunate tonight. We're going to dive into the book a little bit more, and we're going to apply it to today because for those of you who regularly view our program, you know that what we're really all about is starting a local conversation about our rights, our civil rights, what the amendments have to say and what it means for us today. So we're really fortunate. We have 3 wonderful guests who joined us here in the studio tonight, and I'd like to just take a minute and introduce each person and tell you a little bit about them. First, we want to welcome Catherine Buntain. Catherine used to be my neighbor in Holliston, actually, while we were raising our children together, and now she lives in Sherburne. A management consultant and executive coach, Catherine spent most of her career addressing issues of diversity and inclusion in all types of organizations, from Fortune 100 companies to foundations, universities, and nonprofits in the U.S. and abroad. She's taught extensively on issues related to race and gender and analyzed organization climate and culture in terms of their abilities to include and value people from all types of ethnicities, genders, physical abilities, educational backgrounds, religious and cultural diversities. In recent years, Catherine has spent time in the rural South examining how community colleges assist or limit students' access toward upward mobility, an effort which has allowed her to compare and contrast progress on racial equality in the North and the South. She's also been active as a mentor to young adults and an ally to the LGBTQ community. So welcome, Catherine. Secondly, we have Kitty Baker. And Kitty is a native of Pennsylvania, but has lived for most of her adult life in Massachusetts. She presently lives in Franklin. Kitty is a retired educator specializing in early language acquisition. For many years, she's worked as a publishing editor and consultant, mentoring elementary reading teachers. Active in the First Congregational Church, which is the church that I'm the pastor of, Kitty co-chairs a group of interested folks who are passionate about issues of social justice, providing a safe space to grow in awareness and understanding of the roots of systematic racism. With insights from folks active in the field, like our next guest, Eva Stahl, we gain a valuable perspective on the ways in which our communities perpetuate and sustain racial injustice, while discovering tools to root it out. And thirdly, we want to welcome Eva Stahl. Eva has lived in Holliston for 17 years and has 3 children with her husband, Matt Brown. Eva works in Boston at a nonprofit promoting health care for all and health justice. This work connects community engagement with people's lived experiences with policy agendas that dismantle systematic racism in the healthcare system. She is an active member of her church community. She sits in the Community Preservation Committee and supports the rebuilding of Goodwill Park. Eva is a member of the Anti-Racism Working Group led by Kitty at the First Congregational Church. She has worked to amplify issues of racism in Holliston schools and the Holliston Police Department alongside other concerned residents. We want to thank all of you so much for being with us tonight. So John is going to jump in a little bit in terms of the nitty-gritty of the book. We want you to jump in as well, and we also want to say for anyone watching live on Facebook tonight, if you have comments or questions, please just type them in and we'll answer them as we go along.
So I echo Bonnie in thanking you for being here tonight, especially with you know, the vast experience that each one of the 3 of you have. And like I said, jump in at any time. I broke this book down into actually 3 different areas. So I'm going to outline the first area a little bit and then maybe get some comments from you, Bonnie, and from our guests. I mean, I think most of us see the Civil War as a tipping point in terms of how things changed in America in terms of race relations. But before that, I see it as an area of confusion in terms of how our country would deal with slavery, right from having it written into the Constitution, and that slaves would be considered 3/5 of a person for apportionment in terms of representatives. Today, hopefully, that would never happen, but it's in our Constitution. Also, after our founding, another major point was the federal fugitive slave law, which tells me that the northern territories, of which we're part of, had our own opinions in terms of slavery, but also we were willing to abide by certain federal laws that said that if a slave escaped and made it to the north, that we would have to comply and the slave would be returned to the south. Once again, this confounds us when we read about our own history, and it is disappointing. And the last part was a concerted effort, at least from the majority of the people that made laws at the time, to make sure that slavery did not expand to the Northwest Territories. We were in a period of time where our country was still growing, and there seemed to be, at times, a written rule, at times an unwritten rule, that slavery would be allowed to exist where it was, but that it wouldn't be able to expand. And then we had the Civil War. So before we get into the Civil War and how it affected race relations, I'd like your comments and our guest comments about our founding and the period of time before the Civil War.
Well, I guess for me, when I was reading the book, it didn't tell me, it didn't say anything I didn't know, but to see it right there in print, to have to relive all of that, to realize, the book is titled Unfinished Business, and it makes me really wonder, and I know we're going to talk about this, as a country, will we ever be able to finish this? Will we ever be able to make it right? And what makes it so hard, unlike other things, this is what we were founded on. This goes back to the very beginning. As you said, it's in our Constitution. And so I think so much of our history is about trying to take steps to make that wrong right, and then there's a reaction. Right? There's a reaction because people are afraid. People are afraid to lose what they have or their identity. And so then there's a reaction, and then there's steps again in the right direction, and then there's a reaction. And I think it can be really overwhelming because, again, we were founded on racism. It's as old as we are. So I don't know. I mean, did you have any general reactions to that before we move?
Give you a general reaction. I come from a biracial family, and so I have seen it from both sides of this. And as you read the history of our country, and this book lays it out, but as you read the history of our country, it seems kind of rosy. We had slavery, but it's over now. And so we've come past it. And that really is not true. And I think all of us have grappled with the reality of the fact that the country still has a very long way to go. And we must be honest with one another. It's the honesty that I think is the stopping point for us, because we want to believe that we're better than that.
Right.
And sometimes we're not.
Right. Right. Catherine.
I really want to support what you're saying and challenge us. I think as a white person working in this area, one of the most profound moments of learning for me was really being taught about the Middle Passage and about how a man walking down a path in Africa was suddenly seized by a stranger from another tribe and thrown into a net and taken to a port where he was surrounded by strangers speaking different languages, different cultures, enemies. And that precipitated a whole movement towards becoming an American of sorts that involved deconstructing his entire life and personality, taking his name away, separating from his children and spouse, his language, his culture, his music, not being allowed to marry, not being allowed to have your own name, forever carrying the name of your slave holder. And just, I think for white Americans, it's very difficult to understand that that's a different kind of immigration than my Irish or Italian ancestors. That those of us who identify with our ethnic heritage as whites, there was a different sort of support and foundation. There was some kind of real estate. There was some kind of business acumen. There were connections. There were people who'd come before. That it really is profoundly different, and this is what causes the institutionalization of the problem. If you never opened a bank account as a black person until, 1970 in your entire family, then your life as a person with a financial background is fundamentally different. And there are just case after case after case of differentiations that I think white people have no idea exist that contribute to the differences we feel and the differences we experience as citizens.
And I would just say one last thing, which is to reiterate the whole rosy picture. I think that there's real fear with thinking that we're not perfect and that it feels like a betrayal to challenge, even when you think about the commentary around being a strict constructionist or, interpreter of the Constitution, as if that's being true to something that's perfect. And that's just such a falsehood. And that really this is a living document that should grow and change with our own learning, and that it should have room for adjustment and for modern interpretation that values our own humanity and sees one another. And so I think that what is really disappointing is that we need to take a more critical view at a very young age to help our kids understand and learn this history in a really transparent and broad way, and we don't do that. And it needs not be political, because it needs to be about being American.
And I think John and I are both in agreement, because we've talked about that before, we both look at the Constitution as a living document.
Oh, sure.
Because otherwise, why do the show? Right, because it would be like, well, and as a preacher, I mean, it's the same that I feel about the Bible, right? There's a lot of things in the Bible. Slavery is in the Bible. But I don't believe that it's stuck in time. I believe that we are meant with the Constitution to grapple with it, right? And what does it mean for us today?
Right. I would also point out, before we move on to, say, the Civil War and later times, we have somewhat of a hypocritical past in terms of race relations. I mean, some of our founding fathers owned slaves, yet they preached equality. And they wrote it into their documents, but they also wrote into their documents slavery. So it is somewhat hypocritical. Also, in a broader sense, states like our own, Massachusetts, had a number of people that were abolitionists. But when push came to shove, some of them backed off
Yeah.
and weren't able to stay true to that theme. Now, it's easy for us in this day to say what we would have done back then, but it wasn't perfect. Like you said, it's not a perfect nation, and we're not perfect people. When we move on to the Civil War, or when the professor moves on to the Civil War, he talks about the reasons for the war itself. I think a lot of people who don't study it might think it's just about slavery, and it wasn't. It was about states' rights. It was about politics. It was about the economy, two different economies. I mean, you know, a naive view of, say, Abraham Lincoln would be that, you know, he led us through the Civil War just to end slavery. But there were political reasons behind why he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So why don't you jump in?
Well, no, I mean, go ahead. But I was just going to say that, right, he was a politician. And I think that's what the book really keeps getting back to as well, is that none of these things happen in a vacuum, right? Again, there's this tension between, and I don't want to jump ahead to Brown right away, but we were talking about that before, that it was like a law gets implemented to try to bring about more racial equality, or we have the 13th Amendment, you know, where you abolish slavery, but then steps aren't really taken until the people of the United States take a step forward, because the politicians want to get reelected. Sure. That's what they care about more than doing the right thing. I think it was true then, and it was true now. I'm not saying that none of them want to do good. I don't mean to imply none of them have a moral compass, but they want to get reelected. And the executive branch wants to maintain power. The Supreme Court sometimes reflects the will of the people, but sometimes not, right? Depending on how that is. And I just feel like, so what does it really come down to? I feel like what he's saying in this book, and what I know I really feel in my heart, it comes down to we, the people, the citizens, to say the way that we have treated people of color in this country is unacceptable. Yes, things have changed, but it's not like there is racial equality now. And what are the things that we can do to hold our elected officials responsible to helping to implement these laws? And what are the things that we can do outside the system, said like a good activist, right, that can help bring these changes about? So
right. I mean, you know, and he doesn't just limit himself to you know, the black and the white races. He talks a little bit about, you know,
talked about the Japanese
the discrimination against the Chinese in the late 1900s and the Japanese during World War II. I mean, think about that if anything close to that happened today. I mean, in reading this book,
Actually,
no, I know, but I mean, you know, especially with like the Chinese Exclusion Act and bylaws or laws that were passed that, you know, you can't run a laundry on a city street. You can't carry laundry on a city street, or the Japanese internment during World War II. I mean, it's not a good past, but it's not a past that we can ignore, and it's one that should be taught so that it isn't repeated. I mean, maybe we have some comments from our guests.
it's about power, right? So it's about having power over others, and it's you know, I think there are so many different thoughts, but it's, you know, I think for me that's the core piece of it, is that it comes down to, you know, using othering, using, you know, which is a term we use where, you know, positioning yourself in a better position than to be better than someone else. And you see this sort of, you know, emerge more deliberately, which we'll probably talk about later, through the Southern strategy and sort of the political maneuvers around what we call wedge issues, which is to sort of stoke fear to sort of make people feel like they're losing their position or their power as a way to have a common enemy of sorts. So, yeah, it's disturbing.
I agree, and I think there are so many paradoxical things about the way we've handled race and other differences in the country, and we seem to see citizenship as a scarcity, and to, you know, beginning with this notion of 3/5 of a person, it's permeated the way we think about citizenship and about others and about ourselves, like how much of me can be included, and we notice things about others that might intimate that they should be excluded. And we have never found that we the people, we have never decided that citizenship and citizenry for all of us should be the principle that unites us and makes us one. And I can't have it if you don't have it. It's like the signs you see in front of the churches, you know, if it doesn't work for you, it won't work for me. And I think that that's escaped us. And when we need to look at our part in this, we need to say, how is citizenry being chipped away, or how is citizenry being expanded by my behavior? I like to call it, turning the ladder to a bridge. You know, we have a model kind of, there's a ladder and some people need to be on top, and that's the power. Mm-hmm. And we scramble over each other up and down the ladder, and at the bottom there's masses of people trying to move up. If we would just flip it over and say, we're side by side, let us walk back and forth across and see each other's experience and realize that now we have a strong foundation. We have something that can hold all of us. But that's the essential thing. And we don't have to give up anything to flip that ladder to a bridge. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how we're going to get there, but I think it starts with caring as much about your citizenry as I do my own.
Mm-hmm. But you also touch on the issue of essentially institutionalizing racism and going back to the Constitution, and just the fact that from the very beginning that we devalue other people's humanity. And so part of it is acknowledging that so many of our policies and our structures reinforce that, and that we have to also step away and figure out what they are so that we dismantle them and turn them into a bridge.
Yeah. And one example is just this week, we're talking about educated voters, the intimations that we're going to begin to qualify what kind of people get to have a voice again, which is code, very scary code for the same things we tried to engineer our way out of through the Constitution amendments and through our civil activity.
Yeah. No, it's all right. I also think we are in love with the language of the Constitution. So it just, all men are created equal and have inalienable rights, and we're in love with that language, but we don't look under that language. And I was saying to Bonnie before we began tonight, this was a week of celebration of the Normandy invasion. That was a wonderful thing, and everyone was lauding and praising the heroism of those people. They deserve that, and certainly we laud that also. But if we begin to dig under that, we understand that at that point in our history, the Army was not desegregated. There were very few benefits for the men who came back from the Second World War. If you were a person of color, you didn't get the bennies and the perks that the white soldiers got when they came back. And so somewhere in the soul of minority people in the United States is a kind of a curled up lip when it comes to the 4th of July celebrations. I believe, and I may be wrong about this, but someone once said that the 4th of July celebration is not really for people of color, because it was not a celebration of the victory over slavery. So we need to keep that in our minds and still work toward that perfect union that we all really want.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Civil War, or the outcomes of the Civil War. That's it's a small subject. We can do it in 5 minutes, right? So anyway, the Civil War is coming to an end. It's apparent that the North is going to win, and we come up with the 3 what's called Civil War amendments, which we talked about earlier: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. And we see Reconstruction start in the South, but like Bonnie had said earlier, and it was a great point, there's always a pushback, sometimes a violent pushback. And 2 things that come to mind are the Ku Klux Klan, which started around about 1870, and it started just with 6 ex-Confederate soldiers. It was going to be a social club, and we've seen what it's become, and the Jim Crow laws.
Right.
which came into being, which were centered around trying to deflate the 15th Amendment, or at least in my view, which were, the 15th Amendment tells you that you cannot disenfranchise someone based on race. But what did they do? Well, can you read?
Tax.
Yeah, can you pay a tax?
Right.
If you can't do these things, then you can't vote. So there was a pushback. Reconstruction carried through until the election of 1876, and then there was a disputed election with Rutherford B. Hayes, and there was a compromise. And basically the compromise was, you know what, we think that the South is rehabilitated and they can move on their own. The North will not be bothering them anymore. And what happened? Jim Crow accelerated, the Ku Klux Klan grew, and we started making movements backwards, as far as I'm concerned. But what's your thoughts?
No, exactly. I mean, again, for every step forward, there's a reaction, and we've been talking about that. It comes from fear and, wanting to hold on to power. And, I thought, Catherine, what you said was so beautiful, because I was thinking about what kind of country would we really have, if we turned it around and we did all walk together as, fellow citizens, really acknowledging our full rights and our differences. And to celebrate that, we spend so much time holding on out of fear to what we have, and we're afraid to give that up. And I'll just interject here. When I went to seminary in 1980 to Boston University, I came from New Jersey, which compared to Massachusetts, well, at least where I was from in New Jersey, was pretty diverse compared to here. But still, I go to Boston University, and I forget what the course was, and Jim Frazier was the professor, and the first question that he asked, he said, is there anybody in this classroom who's white who feels that growing up in this racist society that you haven't absorbed some of that racism? And there was that hesitancy. And I didn't know what to answer at first, and I kind of looked around, all right, is anyone else raising their hand? Should I be raising their hand? And he just said very calmly, he goes, if you're white, put your hand up. And that was like the real beginning for me of understanding. He didn't say, if you're a bad person, put your hand up. If you're a horrible person, it was like, you grew up in this society, of course you've absorbed some of it. And that was the first time, I was 23 years old, that anyone had ever said that to me. And over the decades, now I'm 33. No. But as I've absorbed it over time, I've come to understand personally that for me, what it means is that I find guilt very immobilizing. And it doesn't help anyone if I'm immobilized. But responsibility, understanding, to take action, that's what, for me, I feel like it's all about. So we share this history. And we could overcome this history if we weren't so afraid to lay down our defenses and to admit who we are and where we are and then move forward.
Well, I mean, to your point, in terms of what you experienced at BU, and I'm going to bring it back to law enforcement or police work, and one of the new areas of learning, probably in the last 5 or 6 years for law enforcement, is implicit bias. And usually the class will start with an instructor, and sometimes it's a person of color, and we'll have a crowd of 30 people, and the first question will be, if you're prejudiced, raise your hand. And no one will raise their hand.
Right.
But in the end, they all are.
Right.
There's a difference between being a racist and being prejudiced. And sometimes prejudice is based on, what is your background? Where do you come from? And yes, you do have an implicit bias. We all have implicit bias, and the idea is to finally recognize it,
Right.
work with it, mitigate it, and hopefully eliminate it.
Right, because if we don't bring it to the surface, we don't have any chance of changing it.
And like one of our guests had mentioned earlier, sometimes we think we're perfect as a nation, sometimes we think we're perfect as a person.
Right.
We need to recognize that we're not.
But you raised the importance of also, you're in a very sensitive field, right, where those interactions are really important. And implicit bias training is one huge step forward. And, just so everyone at home knows that you can actually Google it and take the test yourself. My kids have all done it. So where you look at fast images and you have reactions reactions to them, and they help you understand the Harvard study.
35.
Yeah,
I got addicted
you can.
one
Yeah.
day.
Yes, you did. I remember.
That'd take a long time.
It does. But the other, so I work in the healthcare space, and so you can imagine this is an equally sensitive space where people's lives are also at risk. And not being able to trust the provider or the person that is charged with caring for your safety and your wellness is horrifying.
Right.
Both as just being the experience of the individual, but it also means that it creates outcomes, right? And those outcomes create disparities, as we see in sort of the treatment of people by police, but also the treatment of people by physicians, providers, and health professionals that, have terrible consequences. So it's such an important conversation to have, but also to see ourselves for what we've been shaped by, which is media and images, and bombarded by these things that are implanted in us and shape who we are. And until we can recognize those things, we're not able to step outside them and take a deep breath and recognize those biases and then change our behavior.
Right.
So I think it's important in so many fields that interact, but it's also about creating that bridge to have a more equitable future.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had an opportunity to develop a curriculum for South African medical students. And one of the things we tried with them, because of they tended to be very logical, rational, and they were also very diverse and had lots of issues because of the types of countries they came from and the religious backgrounds they had, is really just understanding that prejudging is just a faculty of the mind. It's a basic defense mechanism that allows us to discern how we move through the world safely and affiliate or don't affiliate in our interest. And that, the amygdala and those other parts of the brain that are animal parts of our brain, they're always trying to influence towards that safety. And if we can say, this is a faculty that I have that's evolved, over time, but still lags behind what my rational reason part of my brain or my process, would dictate, we slow ourselves down and say, why do I want to cross the street? Do I need to cross the street? How do I say hello instead of crossing the street? And it really takes not being afraid of prejudice. It takes, but not turning it into an ism. And I think we want to be so good that we want to not be human. And it's just, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with imperfection.
Yeah,
like you said.
one of the, and I taught it for a number of years, implicit bias, and one of the things you try to use some humor, and you try to not put somebody on the spot, and one of the things we put up on the screen or in a PowerPoint slide is a broken plastic chair, all right? And so you put it up there and you say, what is this? And the whole crowd of police officers will say, it's a cheap white chair. And I'll say, where do you buy it? Walmart. How much does it cost? $5. And I said, you just made those decisions, 3 decisions, just like that. All of you. Nobody hesitated. I said, do you think that you don't have an implicit bias on whether it be objects or even people?
Yeah, that's a really good.
So one of the tools that we use with community engagement on this issue is we try to be respectful of people's experiences by just asking questions and listening. And so something that they do at a community health center in Jamaica Plain is they train physicians to just ask the simple question of, have you had experiences with racism in the healthcare setting before? And while you don't have the answers, you're still saying, I'm going to honor your experience. And it goes back to, I think, some of the issues around defensiveness, which is sort of what's intention and what's impact. So even though, for example, that people of color in a community might feel that they're impacted a certain way, the intent might not be there, but people don't understand that. So until you sit down and you ask and you listen to those experiences, then you kind of have to step outside that experience like, wow, maybe the actions that I'm taking are hurting others, and I don't even realize that I'm doing it because I'm responding from that kind of quick response, right, that's innate to who I am as a human.
And I just want to throw in, too, that at the First Congregational Church, Kitty co-chairs a group. Eva's a part of the group. And do you remember what we call ourselves? I think it's evolved.
It has evolved, and we call ourselves something different every other time we meet, I do believe, but depending on the month. Okay. But we are just a discussion group, and we sit down and talk about racism and what it means to us and how it manifests itself. And almost every time we have met, someone has an experience that comes kind of out of the blue, and we'll talk about it and talk about how to respond to that. And Eve has been really, really helpful about the responses, you know, rather than getting your back up and saying, well, that's ridiculous.
Right.
Where do those responses hit us? And they hit us in the heart.
Right.
And so understanding that a police force has anti-bias training, that healthcare institutions have anti-bias training, this is wonderful. This is moving us forward, as we hope it will, but it is moving us forward. But in our group at church, we've talked a great deal about how do we as individuals move ourselves forward? How do we recognize, what do we recognize about our own biases? And by golly, we all have them. Mm-hmm. So it's important to think about. It's important to think deeply about, and that's what our group has been about, the thinking.
That's what reminded me of it. Is that, right, you do a really great job of allowing people to ask the questions.
Right.
You know,
and to be embarrassed sometimes.
Right.
You know.
Right. To say, right. And you create that safe space for people, which I think is so vital. And you don't find that everywhere. You don't find that everywhere. And I feel like I want to speed us up to today, but I want to make sure
I'll pick it up. I'll pick it up.
Well.
So after Reconstruction ended, then we moved into an era where the South was kind of left alone. But there were challenges to, you know, racial prejudice, and a lot of them reached the courts. And the first one was in the late 1900s, which was Plessy versus Ferguson, which is the precursor to Brown versus the Board of Education. And in Plessy, without going into the facts, it had to do with railroad cars.
Right.
And it was separate but equal. And that was followed up by Brown, which we'll talk about, which was Plessy versus Ferguson being overturned. Okay.
And can you say what you said before we went on camera tonight about Brown? Because I think it was before where we were discussing, and you were saying that even though that went into effect, nobody did anything about it until there was political pressure.
Right.
To do
I mean,
so.
when you think about it, just based on the dates alone, I mean, Brown was decided in 1954. All right. It took another 10 years before we had a Civil Rights Act passed by the Johnson administration, but started by the Kennedy administration, followed up 1 year later by a Voting Rights Act. So 10 and 11 years later, Brown is finally being put into effect, and then the third branch, the executive branch, gets involved in the late 60s, early 70s, trying to carry out what both the courts and the legislature has said.
And the only reason, I think, at least if I understand my history correctly, like Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy were not in favor of the Civil Rights Act. It was only after a lot of public pressure. Mm-hmm. It was after seeing the images of people being beaten at these marches down south. It was after so much public awareness and so much risk to people of color that they were willing to take in order to bring that movement to bear. It was only then that the politicians said, oh, okay, now I'm for it, which is really sad.
I thought it was very interesting in the book how they talked about the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King, of course, was very instrumental in pushing Johnson over the edge on that. But that in the context of the civil rights movement and AACP and various organizations that came out at the time, that they had to adopt strategies that would produce those images, that would produce the risk of that violence. And those were called successes because they moved us politically and socially at enormous personal cost to people. And if you ever go to the Edmund Pettit Bridge and you are down there in Alabama and you're looking at the films of them 3 times trying to cross that bridge and being beaten and thinking they're just walking across the bridge. So I just thought the author made such a point of the adoption of the civil rights workers of all races to take on these high-risk behaviors in order to begin to inform and influence our view of what really needed to happen. It's really scary, really hard.
I also think we need to also take into consideration that those were not only black people.
Right.
There were a lot of white people who stood up for black people, who stood up for rights, and they're here today, but their voices may be, the drumbeat is beating out those voices, but we're here, and we're not going to go away.
I mean, I look back at those people, and from what I read as well, and they had a wider lens in terms of how they looked at things.
Yes.
I mean, maybe today it's more individual lenses as opposed to wider. But to think about that, you know, you're a college student in the North, and you go down and you become a freedom rider, or you're
Right, registering people to vote.
right,
And
right.
yeah.
I mean, there's a picture in here, and I'm not going to try to search it now, but a skinny white guy in a suit, and he's covered in blood, which tells you quite a bit. You know?
We had 3 of them in Mississippi.
Right,
Right.
who were,
Right,
who were murdered. But I like what you just said, John, about the wider lens. And Martin Luther King held that vision, right, of a movement. It was something larger than any one person. And today we've become so individualistic that we lose sight. It's back to what you were saying early, Catherine. We lose sight that on our own individual way, we're not going to get very far.
It's like we've lost the value of the collective.
Yeah.
Right. But it's also, I think, mired in the growth of media and the fact that no one can turn anything off. I mean, it was something that Catherine said about, you know, people, when we see the images of people being hurt is when people begin to sort of step up and take more action.
Yes.
And so then you would hope that, you know, the increase in media attention and the visuals that go with that would raise awareness. But now we're tangled up in what's real and what's not.
Right.
And so that becomes another sort of divisive tool to sort of break us down. But we do have this vicious cycle and this habit of, you know, violence begets more violence. We tear each other down and then we build back up. And so it's an interesting time in history to see where we end up.
And you have to have strong leaders. I mean, you had mentioned the Kennedys, and
Right.
you know, it wasn't until those images
Inspiring
were portrayed
leaders.
to them.
Inspiring leaders,
Right, right. But I mean, you know, they saw that, and I think at one point I listened to a conversation on tape from Robert Kennedy down to, I forget which governor in the South, might have been in Alabama, and, you know, he wasn't taking any pushback. He said, this needs to end, it needs to end now, or we're going to send in the National
I saw
Guard.
that too.
Right.
I saw that too, whatever
I
documentary.
mean, yeah, I mean, to put your foot down and to say, listen, this needs to be done, and they did.
Well, and that, you know, and I was going to say, and then, you know, we're talking about reactions, and I want to make sure we have time to get to that. It took me a while. So when Barack Obama was elected president, I was not one of those people that thought, well, gee, we're now in a post-racial society. I was one of those people, though, that was pretty naive and optimistic and felt like it, okay, so we've turned a corner. We're not all there, but we've turned a corner. And it took me a while to understand that Donald Trump is just a response to the first black man. You know I wanted to talk about this because I just think this is really important to understand. At least for me, it was really important to understand that this is a backlash. And just like this book is chronicled, it's happened throughout history and it's happening again. If Barack Obama does not become president, probably either does Donald Trump, right? And so maybe the hope now is that there'll be another reaction to that. But how do we stop the whiplash, you know, and take some real steps forward?
I wish I knew.
Do you agree that Donald Trump is a reaction to Barack Obama? Or am I misreading that?
No, I do agree with that. And I think that's all I can say about him.
I mean, I would just add that it's very complicated, and it's layered with so many other issues, growing income inequality, right? The stress on families for upward mobility, and that level of insecurity and anxiety, and sort of mixed in with all of the sort of the social media 24-hour news, crisis after crisis, that creates this sense of urgency, I think, across different sections of the population to take action in some way and protect, right, at any cost. And so I think it's intensely complicated, but but I think that we'll see what happens the next round. But I think that there's a lot of work to be done in helping people see one another in a helpful way.
I just wanted to add a perspective that I think about a lot, which is so much of my work happened in Fortune 100 companies or Fortune 50 companies, and during the affirmative action era and as it was being dismantled. And very few people actually understand what affirmative action meant. It was never about advancing someone who was less qualified, never. And very few people understand that. But we've grown away from having corporations be communities where we could model what good inclusion and good citizenry was. We've lost that long-term contract between the employee and the employer. We've lost, pensions and stay for life and be one of us. And outside of Silicon Valley and a few really outstanding old corporations, that's gone. So the diversity training in organizations, which was huge in the 80s, it's gone. It doesn't happen anymore. You have to plug into the computer and listen to a course, but you don't sit in a room with people who are different from you and talk about how your life at work is different and talk about who should we help advance, who needs to be put in these positions. And so I think a lot of the loss has happened because we don't have those institutions really modeling and pushing and believing that this makes them more competitive. And I think that to me, the kind of death of the private sector interest in this equality and in citizenry has kind of allowed everything to fall apart, because that's where the money is, right? And when we stop believing that diversity is good for us, then it spreads sideways through all of our institutions. And it made my job go away. That's how significant it is.
Yeah, I love what you just said too, right? That when we believe that it's of value to all of us, that's when we all win and we're able to move forward with that.
Yeah, I mean, to play off what you're saying, and I think I hear you correctly, in the public sector, diversity training has become mandatory. In the private sector, it's extinct. It's not there anymore.
Well,
It's just that you watch the safety video, then you watch the diversity video, and no more 9-day retreats, no more interest groups that look at how people can advance, and it's just very rare. It's very for a while we believed that inclusion could make us all better and could make our businesses and our organizations run better.
And they'll do it on an emergency basis, like Starbucks.
Yeah,
Right. We're
we'll
closing
close
everybody
for half
down.
an hour, right?
A 4-hour training for everybody in the country.
But I think it also speaks to the nature of work has changed.
Exactly.
Right? And so instead of, I totally hear you, but we also need to think about what's next, because I don't see that. It's not coming back. I think that it's, and that ties into, I think, the trends around voting too, is that people long for something that was, and they're not thinking about what has yet to be. And so without a leader that can provide that visioning, there's let's bring back the coal mines, right? It's that kind of approach, which that's the part of the country that I grew up in, when I think the reality is no, let's use that open space for clean energy.
Where did you grow up, Eva?
So I grew up in Missouri, and my family's from West Virginia. Okay. So, it's, I think that it's about being creative and having true vision in our leadership, which I think is lacking at the moment, to be perfectly honest.
You're right, it is. And I'd like to say that I'm not susceptible to messages about, things were better. But, I've turned into one of those old ladies I never wanted to be, where, I'll be sitting around and saying, it was so much easier when I was raising my kids or whatever. And I feel like, I'll speak for myself, that I am susceptible sometimes to thinking, there was a better time, an easier time, and if we could go back. And you're right, that's not the message. The message is change is happening, progress, that's why I'm a progressive, right? Progress, moving forward, and what can we envision that's new and that's better, that can bring us together in a new way. and we all have to do that.
Yeah, and I think particularly, I can't speak for people of color, but for people of color, like nobody wants to go back. And so
Right.
they're, you know, and so part of it is also remembering that and thinking about at least we're starting to have conversations and have the tools and the language to be thoughtful about recognizing other people's experiences and why the movement forward is so important. But I still go back to living in a community that's mostly white, but is changing and becoming more diverse, just how incredibly important it is locally to be having these conversations and to be stressing that these conversations need to happen in all different places, including our schools,
Right.
including our police departments, across our selectmen and women. And so it's just making the excuse that we don't really have enough to talk about because we're mostly white is all the more reason to have those conversations,
good
because
point.
we want our residents and our future sort of young people to grow up feeling robust and nimble in their ability to engage in these important conversations if we really want to make change.
I think she's aptly summed up the purpose of this whole show. You know, so I mean, any final thoughts?
Well, I was going to ask you the same thing. I was just going to say I really appreciate so much the three of you being willing to come on our season finale show, because these conversations, they're difficult. They're hard, and yet they're so important that they happen, as you said.
And they
you
can be
know.
misinterpreted. You know, so I expect some comments.
Well, that's great, though, because
But that happens.
what we
That
want
happens.
is to have that conversation. You know, we don't come here on any of our shows pretending to have the answers.
Sure.
We just look at, you know, our constitutional rights, how they have played out or not played out so well in our society, and hopefully begin that conversation. So again, I just want to thank you so very much. What you have brought to this program tonight has meant so much to us, and I know to others as well. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. So that's it.
Season 2?
Season 2, we'll
Pick
probably,
up in September?
We will, and we will probably do some type of a promotion on the next one before September.
Great, so keep watching.
Keep watching, and we appreciate everybody that does watch and comments and gives us suggestions going forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.